try again. Recording. Cool.
All right. So before we start this week, I sent out an email already kind of talking about my stance on current events and also talking about why I'm continuing to teach this course despite current events. And the reason that it is my hope that this can be part of the solution. And obviously I welcome feedback on whether or not people think that that's actually the case. But the war on drugs is rooted in and founded upon racism, and it continues to thrive and be perpetuated by racism. Racism is what feeds this entire system. I want everyone to consider, if you are able to, donating to bail funds, donating to BLM, making sure that you're up to date on everything that's happening right now, and making sure that if you are performing activism right now, it is not performative activism. That's a really big issue that we're seeing, and a really big reason that we're seeing so many problems arising from protesting right now is because of performative activism that is not following Black and Brown leadership. So please make sure that you are being mindful of that during this time. I wish that I could dedicate more time tonight to talking about this issue and making this a part of discourse in this course right now. But due to my own time constraints and also due to the fact that this remains a course about drugs, we're going to continue talking about drugs, and we're going to make sure that as soon as possible in the semester we get to the parts of this course that start tying these things together. So as I've said in the email that I sent out, the request that I have is that if your voice is easily heard already, this is a prime place in this Zoom to start exercising your ability to not speak up first. So make sure that you are giving the floor in this class to communities that are not white. And if you are a white guy in this class, then wait a couple seconds before offering your opinion so that other people may have the floor first, please. So everyone can kind of do their part in minor ways of starting to work towards equity in this way. If this request makes you uncomfortable, talk to me. We'll talk about why I'm asking you to do this, and we can go from there. So just please make sure to be mindful of your privilege and your place in this class in particular and everywhere else. And with that being said, let's continue. Okay. So last we left off, we were playing my absolute favorite game of Name That Drug, and we did not finish it. So, feels weird kind of like jumping into this right now, but any guesses what this is on the left? Thoughts, feelings, prayers, concerns? I know that I literally just asked everyone to like be mindful before speaking first, but with stuff like this, I feel like you can kind of just yell it out.
Some kind of MDMA pill?
MDMA pill? Thoughts?
Adderall.
Adderall? Anything else? Okay, well, it's not.
Oh.
Close enough, that's fine. Yeah, it looks like Adderall though, right? Oh.
A shrubbery!
What about this one on the right? Thoughts, feelings, concerns, prayers?
Wrong.
I hope these all feel like trick questions because they 100% are. I'm 100% trying to make this difficult. Any thoughts of what this might be? Just tell me the obvious answer, you know?
Adderall.
Adderall. Yeah, everyone's like, oh, Adderall. Okay, it's caffeine and meth. Like, aha.
Another shrubbery!
Right. So I really hope that, and some of you I know kind of missed the beginning of Name That Drug because we had a crossover of classes from Monday and Tuesday, etc. But as a little recap, for those of you that did not get to watch the recap video of last time, which I uploaded like an hour ago, sorry. This basically is a game to indicate the complete impossibility of identifying a substance just by looking at it. So again, we have blotter paper here, right? And fun fact about blotter paper, and I'm sure that many of you that have been around or heard about acid in the past have heard of it being called blotter. And the word blotter and blotter paper came from someone who kind of accidentally knocked over a vial of LSD onto blotter paper, which is used to blot up excess ink in printmaking and art projects. And he was like, oh shit, this actually kind of works pretty well. And it just spread like wildfire from there. And that's how blotter started in the first place.
Baby.
Yeah.
Baby.
What did you say?
Oh shit, sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I'm talking to my cat. My bad.
Okay, that's fine. I loved every second of it. So, any thoughts on what this might be? It's on, oh, hello. What this might be, it's on blotter paper. What drug?
Is it LSD?
You might think so. But it's actually DOC on that particular one. It's DOC is part of a chemical of, or a family of chemicals called DOX, and that just means that you can substitute out the X for different letters that indicate a different drug that's within a family of drugs. So like DOI, DOM, DOC are all in that family. So they have kind of similar effects. What about this one? Blotter paper. What might be on it? Just say the obvious one.
Is it more LSD?
I'm glad you asked that, but it's actually 25-I-N-bome. And for those of you that are not familiar with 25-I-N-bome, it was a very problematic adulterant that hit the market a couple of years ago, particularly in 2014 through 2017. It became a really big issue because if it's bitter, it's a spitter. That's a phrase that you should take with you. If you have a tab of LSD or something that's supposedly LSD that has a very strong metallic bitter taste, chances are it's not actually acid. Acid should not taste like anything. So typically you would put a tab like this or blotter paper underneath your tongue. Don't flick it around like this cat is doing, it will fly out. But sublingual administration works for LSD and for many other drugs on blotter. Interestingly though, there's some controversy about whether or not drugs like 25-I-N-bome actually work if you swallow them. So if you ever encounter a dealer that says that you can't swallow your tab or it won't work, it's probably not acid. Okay, so this concept of purity is really just, I wish that we had some kind of segue back into this. I hate stopping in the middle of a lecture. But this concept of purity is a really interesting one because people are constantly misunderstanding what purity is as a concept pertaining to drugs. People are always saying to me, no, I know it's pure. It's been tested. I know it's pure. But what does purity mean, right? Like, what are you actually saying when you say that a drug is pure? Because when you're looking at a substance, there are many different things that are usually in it just inherently. So for instance, this thing called an excipient, it's a binder. It's something that causes the materials in your pill to be bound together. So a pressed pill cannot be made of just MDMA inherently because it would crumble and fall apart, and it's got dyes and shit in it too. So if your MDMA pill has a binder in it, then that means that there's another thing that's causing it to stick together. And binders are pretty much always inactive. You know, they're not going to cause problems necessarily unless it's something really sus. It's just to make the drug stick together. So that's not really as much of a concern. Sorry,
I'm not sure your definition of an excipient is accurate as an umbrella term. I'm just letting you know.
Do you want to elaborate?
So I think that you are correct that some excipients are used as binding agents, but I think that they have different functions depending on the type of excipient. So like for instance, there are excipients that are added to drugs in order to make them taste better, so kids will want them. Or you know, in the opposite direction, there are things that are added to drugs to make sure that they're abused less.
Yes. But, okay, that's a good thing that I should clarify then. What I'm referring to when I say excipient here is merely something that is not a psychoactive component. Because an excipient is not going to be psychoactive, right? It's going to be something that helps a pill stick together and is a filler. It's a binder. It's something that is alongside your active ingredient. Does that kind of clear up what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm saying is I'm not sure all fillers are excipients and all excipients are fillers, or vice versa. I don't remember which way it goes, but
okay.
You know, rectangle square kind of thing.
Thanks for pointing that out. I will send a follow-up email with more information on it and clarify this on the slides. So what we're looking at primarily in terms of impurities, right, are these two things, obviously an impurity and a diluter. So an impurity is something that's in the substance. There are two kinds of impurities we'll get to in a second, but there can either be an impurity that is a product of its manufacturing process. So kind of inherently, as you're making this drug, there will be impurities that arise as you are undergoing the synthesis process. And these impurities can either have an impact on the quality of the drug, or sometimes they're just always in the drug, and we'll come back to that in just a second so I can clarify what I'm talking about. And then a diluter. And a diluter is something that's added as basically a bulking agent. So it increases the profit margins on your substance. So an example of an impurity might be, I think it's MDB is an impurity that's found in the process of making MDMA. And the way that you make MDMA or Molly is you have to wash it repeatedly after you get your product. And if you don't wash it effectively enough, then some of these manufacturing byproducts are still on it. So if you send it to a lab, then it might come back as MDMA and MDB. And you look at that and you're like, oh shit, what the fuck is MDB? But that's just an indicator that the quality of your product is low, right? A diluter is something that is not psychoactive typically, that you add to bulk your product so that you can make more money off of it. And we'll come back to why people would do that in the first place. Now, an adulterant, and this is probably the most relevant term that we'll go over with this. An adulterant is something that is used to cut another drug. And getting these terms right is pretty important, because if you're like, oh, this drug was bulked, that could mean a couple of things. It could mean that someone has put in another substance that is an adulterant, so it mimics the effect of the drug that you're trying to buy. So for instance, if you are selling cocaine to someone and you adulterate it, you might adulterate cocaine with another psychoactive ingredient like, I guess, lidocaine or amphetamine. So amphetamine is an example of a drug that might have a similar, it's Adderall basically, not quite, but it's basically Adderall. Amphetamine is a drug that might have a similar effect to cocaine. So you could adulterate a bag of cocaine by swapping out some of the coke for amphetamine, and therefore that person might not be able to even tell that they have amphetamine instead of coke. And the reason that you would do that is because amphetamine is a lot cheaper and easier to acquire than cocaine. Coke is a very bloody drug in terms of how it's produced and how it's moved around the world. So it's a lot easier to sell amphetamine. And in fact, I almost guarantee that if you've done cocaine at some point in your life without testing it with a kit, it probably was mainly amphetamine. Can't hear you, Peach. What are you saying?
49 days of meditation at the age of
Is someone just unmuted right now?
enlightenment. That day,
Kyle, can you mute yourself?
Sorry.
Okay, so if a substance is cut, it means that there's been another drug that's been put into your baggie, basically, in an effort to emulate the effects of the drug that you want, but it's not the same drug. On the other hand, actually, just kidding, we'll come back to that in a second. So for our intents and purposes, thank you for pointing out the discrepancy, Talia, but for now, we'll say that in the context of pressed pills, an excipient or a binder is something that is not going to necessarily get you high or change the physiological impact of the drug, but it might be something that alters the drug in terms of its taste or its color, or it might be used to press the pill together. If a drug is adulterated, if it's something that you bought as one drug, but it actually contains another drug that is also psychoactive, then that's known as being bunk. So if you buy some bunk shit, that might mean that you bought a pressed pill that has meth in it instead of Molly, because meth in some minor ways might emulate the experience of rolling, especially to the untrained brain. And then diluters or fillers might be something like baking soda, which is not going to get you high. It looks like it's just more white powder in the product, but it's there to make the profit margin greater. Okay, pop quiz. So a white powder sold as MDMA actually contains only baking soda and caffeine powder. The substance is blank because it contains substances other than MDMA. The slang term for this word is what? Can anyone fill in the first blank? Starts with an A.
Adulterated?
Adulterated. And what's the slang term, one of the slang terms for adulteration? There are many, but what's one of the slang terms for adulteration?
Bunk.
Bunk. Buy some bunk shit. Okay. Baking soda is a blank because it's inactive and meant to bulk up the substance. Caffeine powder is blank because it's psychoactive and meant to mimic the effects of the drug that it's sold as. What's the first blank? Baking soda is what because it's inactive and meant to bulk up the substance.
Filler.
What'd you say?
Filler.
Filler, that's right. Also known as a diluter. And then caffeine powder would be what? Because it's psychoactive. Starts with an A.
Adulterant.
As an adulterant, right. So many of these words are used interchangeably in layman's terms, but I just kind of want to give the distinction here is that something that is used to bulk up drugs can be either something that is psychoactive and meant to emulate that drug, or something that is not psychoactive and just meant to give it more bulk, right? So those are the two ways that that can be used. Does anyone have questions on that? I know that's a lot of kind of like overlapping terminology. Okay. So an example of an impurity, and this is really kind of the nitty-gritty of what purity means in the first place. An example of an inorganic impurity is something that's created by the environment, basically that the conditions of manufacturing a drug that are maybe subpar. So if your lab looks like this, then you might have an inorganic impurity, something that gets into the process that's not supposed to be there. And this just basically means that your product is not as good as it could be. An organic impurity, these are all things that naturally occur in the process of making MDMA. So here's MDB, which is what I mentioned earlier. The bolded ones are some of the major ones. These are all just like naturally occurring organic impurities as part of the process. So if you have more of these organic impurities left over from making your drug, it might mean that it just hasn't been washed very effectively, or it's not in its final stage of being synthesized. If you have inorganic impurities in your drug, it means that it's usually been produced in a shitty environment, basically. Or you've added something to it, or your precursors are wonky or something like that. So kind of as a review of adulteration, manufacturer, whoever's making these drugs in the first place, is going to have some pretty beautiful, clean shit that just is basically exactly what you're trying to buy in the first place. If you're a coca farmer and you've just like harvested coca leaves and you've chopped them up and added your baking soda and lime and whatever, you're going to have straight cocaine, right? Because you're the source. And as soon as you move down the supply chain a little bit, usually someone that's a trafficker or is smuggling or moving drugs is going to add a little bit of something or maybe swap something out. And then by the time you get to your local elite dealer, God help us all, our local street dealer, you might have a completely different product that is totally unidentifiable. Or alternately, you might have someone that's selling something that is just a totally different drug altogether, which happens more often than you might think, actually. So for instance, if someone is trying to sell MDMA to you and they have methadone instead, they don't even need to cut Molly because they can just give you rocks of methadone. It's not Molly. And for a lot of people that aren't very familiar with MDMA, they would think that they're the same. They do have a relatively similar effects profile, but methadone is cheaper and it's easier to acquire because of the way that it's made. I can't drill this point home enough. Even the most experienced drug users are often convinced that they can identify a drug by looking at it, smelling it, tasting it, touching it, doing it, but you cannot. I promise you can't unless you are literally a walking mass spectrometer. You can't do it. Don't let people overestimate their own abilities because it could kill them, genuinely. By tasting a drug, you'll not be able to tell. This is lidocaine, this is cocaine. Look at them. They look identical. They smell identical. They taste identical. They have similar effects if you do them, but their toxicology profiles are different. Then you have something like MDMA versus MDA. They look identical. They smell like root beer. They both will taste awful, but they're different drugs. Even though MDMA and MDA are similar, you could swap this picture out for a lot of different compounds and it would still look very, very similar, right? So like, I've just gone through all these hoops to tell you why purity is intensely complicated. So how do we even use the word pure in the first place? And the answer for the purposes of this course are that we're going to say that a substance is pure if it contains only the drug that you're trying to buy. So I'll say that's pure Molly if it's a bag of just MDMA and any organic impurities from the process of making it. I'll say it's impure Molly if it contains MDMA and other drugs as well. Anyone have questions on that? Okay. So we have this map, right? I love maps. I don't know about you guys, but I just fuck with maps. So this map shows us the purities of different drugs as they're being trafficked through different areas of the country. Now I want you to notice something right now about the purities, and this means basically, well, this has actually a definition of purity at the bottom, which is average drug purity defined as a measure of the amount of an illicit substance present in a sample compared to other substances in the same sample, such as adulterants, dilutants, or solvents, basically. So if that puts it in perspective, you have a bag of cocaine, but it's like 40% coke, 20% something else, 40% something else. I hope that added up to 100. I don't know how to count. Then that would be an adulterated drug. It would not be a pure substance. So we see something happening here, right? Is that these are three major points of entry into the United States. Major points of entry. Florida is a huge point of entry for drugs that are brought in from overseas, and Mexico, Mexico border is a huge point of entry for other drugs as well as from Canada. And interesting that the Dakotas have such high drug purities. The Dakotas are known for rural meth labs as well, actually. And rural America is where a lot of drug labs are, because there's less law enforcement out there and more of a DIY attitude. And we'll come back and see that and actually see the environmental destruction that's come from rolling meth labs as well.
That's actually South Dakota and Nebraska. North Dakota borders Canada.
Yeah, well, okay. I said Dakotas too broadly. I do know where the Dakotas are. I really appreciate you saying that. I do know where they are, but like referring specifically to the collection of the Dakotas in this area, it's a strangely high purity zone for drugs to be in, right?
Hmm.
I feel like I look like an idiot now. That would be reasonable. That would be very reasonable. Okay, so just some shit that I should have covered last time. The recorded lectures are now on, I almost said Venmo, but Vimeo. And I've updated the last one that was on to be the Thursday lecture instead of the Wednesday lecture because it was longer. Some of the presenter notes are not complete. I have been behind on getting them complete because the world has been going through a lot recently, and I've been following it very carefully and have not had a lot of time. So now I'm going to try and squeeze a semester of neuroscience into a couple of minutes, which is going to be wild. Is there a breakdown on what drugs this study was looking at? What were you asking that in? Oh, for the average drug purity. I knew that at one point in time. I can find that information out and get back to you. I believe that it was either Coke or just like overall. I think it may have been overall in terms of what a drug was sold as versus what it actually contained. But the problem with all of these images that come from government sources is that, first off, like, how are they collecting this information? Because it's really difficult to get information about drugs and statistics about drugs because people don't self-report having criminalized substances. And second off, it's the government. So, let's try and do some neuroscience. This might be a lot. My face is bathed in this horrifying green light. So what are some factors that influence purity? I know we just went over this.
Manufacturing impurities.
Manufacturing impurities? What are the two kinds of impurities that can come from manufacturing?
Organic and inorganic.
Nice, very nice. What's another thing that influences the purity of your drug?
Fillers.
Fillers. And I'm looking for one more. It's that one that starts with an A.
Adulterants.
Adulterants. And adulterant is probably the most used word that you're going to find in relation to this. So we have, I don't even know what these are supposed to mean. Oh, I even said so. Adulterants, diluters, organic and inorganic impurities. And then, yeah. What's something that is a natural byproduct of making a drug? Natural byproduct.
Organic.
Organic what? Good start.
Organic adulterant.
Very close. You're very close. Can anyone fill in that second word?
Organic
Impurities.
Nice. Very nice. Organic impurities. What legal act scrutinized event throwers for providing harm reduction?
The Rave Act.
My favorite title for any drug law. Can you even believe that's real?
Ugh.
It's amazing, right? What's another
And
name?
it's either Joe Biden or Trump, which is even worse.
I know, man. What's another name for a diluter? Something that dilutes your product.
Filler.
Filler. Nice. And what specific ailment do needle exchanges drastically decrease the occurrence of? Think of one thing right now.
AIDS.
Successes.
AIDS, HIV, yeah. HIV in particular. As Talia pointed out, this is a broader term than I have defined for you here, but what is an example of something that can be used to bind a pill together? What is it called? So it's an E.
An excipient.
Nice. What is skin picking and itching called? It starts with a P. Be very impressed if anyone remembers this.
Pruritus.
Yes, pruritus. And this can come from what two categories of drugs can induce skin picking and itching?
Opioids.
Opioids? What else?
Meth,
Which is under what category?
Stimulants.
amphetamines.
Stimulants. That's under the broad umbrella category of stimulants. But yes, amphetamines and meth are both under the category of stimulants. And then what's it called when you put a drug under your tongue?
Sublingual.
Sublingual administration, right. Let's find out how your brain works. This is a lot of information that I'm about to put in here, and I've used a lot of really weird analogies and metaphors. It's a little bit abstract. It's going to be a ton of information. We're only going to get through part of it today. Please feel free to stop me for clarification on things because this is so much. And I apologize in advance because there's no other way to do this. I promise we will continuously revisit these concepts through the rest of the semester, whatever the fuck it is, day, year, I don't know how much time has passed. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you're confused about this because it's a lot. Let's just first get out of the way what your neurons are. So these are your neurons, but they actually look like that. And that is slowed down too. This is like the speed of an electrical pulse going through your brain that is transmitting information. Does anyone have any guesses of how many neurons are in your brain? Just shout them out.
Trillions.
Trillions? 7. And they all work together so nicely.
7 trillion?
No, I was just saying 7. Just Any other guesses? Number of neurons in the brain.
I thought it's like 3,000, but that just sounds wrong.
There are 100 billion neurons in your brain, packed in there. Every time I read that, I'm worried that I'm not going to actually know how many zeros comes after a billion, and then I'm going to say a million, that's wrong, or something like that. So neurons are also known as nerve cells, and these are basically just like a metric assload of cells that are communicating with each other extremely fast to get information through your brain. The way that this happens is kind of abstract and ephemeral in a way that I had a hard time wrapping my head around for a long time, so I'm not going to try and go super far into that now, because I'll be like, well, I mean, how does this actually result in us feeling things? But we can talk about that later if you want me to unpack that with you, because it's wild, really. Kind of like thinking about how your computer works, and even if you know logically how it works, you're like, this is fucking crazy. So this is a neuron right here in cartoonized form, right? We start up, or where we're really going to be looking at is the axon terminal down here. This is our main area of interest. And this is our nucleus, but we're not really paying much attention to that. Remember that the nucleus is kind of like the brain. What we're looking at here is that neurons are basically all stacked on top of each other, out touching each other in webs. You can think of them like a bunch of people whose fingers are tickling each other's toes. So the fingers here are the dendrites. And if you're tickling someone else's toes with your hands above your head and that person's toe shocks you somehow, then you're going to get shocked, and then your toes are going to shock someone else's fingers, and it's very weird, and we're going to conceptualize this more. So what we have here is basically we start out at the top of the dendrite, we receive electrical information, and this is called an action potential. It's basically a spike of electricity that goes in through the little fingers on the top of the neuron. It gets passed down through its body, which is called the axon, and then that electricity goes out the other end to a neighboring neuron. So that's really all we need to know right now, is that information gets passed along this rope, basically. Now, as it's being passed along this rope, as this electricity is being passed through this neuron, there are these things called myelin sheaths that are these little fatty coverings on the body of this neuron. And this is important. The reason that it's important is that when you plug in your computer to the wall, right, or if you plug in anything, you'll notice that your cord has a rubber coating on the outside of it. And the reason for that is to protect the electricity from scattering, basically, right? If you have an unprotected cord, the electricity is not going to go through it as effectively or at all. And that's the same thing in your brain. The reason that you have these little rubbery, fatty coverings on this neuron is to make sure the electricity goes through. And something that we'll see, not only in some diseases, but also in using too much of a particular drug in some cases, is that the little fatty coverings kind of degrade through time. And what might happen then? You have less electricity passing from neuron to neuron, and your brain doesn't function quite as efficiently as it would otherwise. So keep these things in mind, these little fatty guys in mind, is basically they're covering the wire of your brain to make sure electricity goes through. You can think of them like little sweaters, you know, they're insulators. They're keeping your nerve boys warm. But let's make this weird, okay? Because it would be uninteresting otherwise. So let's envision all of the neurons in your brain as being Putin. Just because, you know, it's a free, I'm not going to say that phrase. Let's just say that every neuron in your brain can be conceptualized like Putin, except he doesn't have a body. People have asked me every single semester why I chose to do this. And to this day, I can't answer the question. So imagine this. You have your fingers on top of your head. You get shocked by electricity. You jump a little bit. Yeah, thank you, Diego. I see you. You get shocked. You jump a little bit, and the electricity travels out of your feet into someone else's fingers, and they're like, oh, God. And it travels through this whole chain, and then all of a sudden you have this massive web of Putins that whoosh, are like, ugh, all at the same time, or kind of. That's staggered a little bit, but the electricity has to go through them, right? So remember, we have electrical signaling that goes in through the fingers, down through the body, and out through the toes to someone else's fingers. So we'll continue with this, because why not? Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard the word neurotransmitter, and some of you might know what it means already, but for those of you that are not familiar with this concept, a neurotransmitter is basically like a relay race. It's like a baton that's passed from one neuron to another. And they're tiny little chemicals. These right here, these little golden boys, are neurotransmitters. Now, if we're looking at this in terms of two neurons, these are the axon terminals, and these are the dendrites. So right down here, we have the feet of the prior neuron. Right here, we have the fingertips of the next neuron. Electricity travels down here, and then something happens that we'll get to in a second, and the electricity continues through or not, depending. And I know that sounds confusing. I promise we will go back into all of this and make it sound less confusing. So different neurotransmitters have different effects, and this is the whole premise of neurobiology and drugs. So in terms of thinking about this like a relay race, we have the foot of the prior neuron, and then we have the head or the finger of the next neuron. That's how information travels. You see them next to each other like this, and if you can imagine it, there would be a whole bunch more that are also branching off of each other, going all over the place. It's a web, it's a network, but we'll envision it like this instead. So just imagine that your brain is full of these guys. Now, in this little space, and just to be clear, what we're looking at right here is, here's the foot, here's the fingertips or the head. This little space right here is the synapse, and the synapse is, because your neurons aren't actually touching each other, they get very, very, very close, but there's a tiny little bit of space between them. And this is how neurotransmitters exert their effects. So you have this thing called the presynaptic neuron. It's basically the neuron on top. We'll think of it as the neuron on top. And then you have the synapse, which is the space between two neurons. And then you have the postsynaptic neuron, which is the neuron on the bottom. So remember, we're thinking of this like people stacked on top of each other, tickling each other's toes. Now,
Their head fingers.
Yeah, they're head fingers. Exactly, they're like antlers or whatever the fuck. Does this even make sense? I have no idea. I have no idea. So we have this electricity that's going down here, right? And this electricity basically zaps the neurotransmitters. This is very simplified. Electricity zaps the neurotransmitters, and these neurotransmitters are little chemicals, right? So they basically get popped out into the synapse, and then they do this thing on the other side, which makes electricity continue through again. Now, there's a reason that this happens, and I'm going to come back to it in a little bit, because you might be like, well, why don't we just have one continuous strand of electricity or whatever the fuck is happening here right now? Why does this need to happen in the first place? And the reason is that when these neurotransmitters do their thing, they have the opportunity to actually stop electricity from going through instead of making it continue through. So this might be a reason, for instance, that if you're feeling a lot of anxiety and your body is like, oh, whoa, like this anxiety is unnecessary, and you calm yourself down, you might be releasing a neurotransmitter called GABA that's actually preventing your brain from continuously firing. It calms you down. So it's interesting. We'll get back around to that. Again, I know this is so complicated. I promise we will pick it apart more. So
Do you
again,
talk about gabapentin at all in this course?
we talk about benzodiazepines and benzo-adjacent drugs. So gabapentin is not quite, obviously it's a different substance, but we can go into it if you're curious. You can ask questions about it when the time comes. Don't worry, it makes sense. Oh my God, that's so nice. So we have electrical signal, becomes chemical signal, becomes electrical signal. Zap, pause, zap, basically, in case I haven't reiterated that enough. Electrical goes to chemical, which is neurotransmitters, goes to electrical. So it looks kind of like this. The electricity comes down, it pops all these bubbles, the neurotransmitters float out, and they do something right here, right? They do something that we'll come back to in just a second, where they float out into, what's this space called? Oh wait, it's like right there. It's the synapse. It's the tiny space between your neurons. So let's look at this more closely again. Okay, I've given you guys a break from looking at these in terms of Putin's, which is, you know, whatever. And we're really only interested in this course in looking at this right here. This is where the magic happens. Like, boy, let me fucking tell you, this is where your melon does all of its work. So if we zoom in on this, where the dendrites, which are the fingers of the next neuron, and the axon terminals, which are the toes of the prior terminal, kiss, then we see this terrifying scientific diagram. And if you're anything like I was 5 years ago, you're shitting your pants right now and crying. But hopefully we'll make it more palatable than that. So this thing, the electricity called the action potential, comes down here, pops the bubbles, the neurotransmitters float out into the synapse, and then they bind at these things that are called receptors. Now, the reason that this is relevant is that when a neurotransmitter binds at a receptor, when it sticks itself into the receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, and again, if any of these terms you're like, I forgot what that means, just say so and I'll explain it again. When you have neurotransmitters that bind at receptors like this, it's basically like putting a lock into a key. You turn the lock, and then in most cases, but not all, a signal will continue through. This is basically how the electricity passes. And I won't get into how exactly that works because it involves chemistry. We don't like chemistry here. But this is what that looks like. And the reason that we see this electricity continuing to go through is because all these neurotransmitters float out, they bind, and then the electricity continues through, okay? So we're looking at this as a lock and key. The neurotransmitter is really our peak interest in this course, is how neurotransmitters do what they do and why. So why the fuck are we talking about this? I don't know, you fucking tell me. I have no idea. I don't even know what day it is, honestly. The reason that this is relevant for drugs is because to your brain, drugs look like neurotransmitters. They fit into the receptors like your neurotransmitters would. And that means that when you're introducing a drug into your body, it's not like this drug is some massive, like completely foreign new thing. The drug is just changing how your existing systems are working temporarily. So for instance, let's say that we have the neurotransmitter serotonin. I'm sure many of you are familiar with serotonin. When MDMA enters your system, it goes through this kind of complicated series of effects that increases how your serotonin system is working. It doesn't add something ridiculous. It just basically like hits the accelerate button on serotonin so you feel more of what you normally would. It's not doing anything that's like incredibly novel. That's what's fascinating about this. So again, we have electricity travels down, these bubbles are popped, neurotransmitters go out into the synaptic cleft, they bind at these receptors, and something happens. Now, if you introduce drugs into the system, then those drugs might do that either in addition to or instead of your existing neurotransmitters. They can make something different happen with an existing system. Now, this thing is called binding. And that's when the neurotransmitter fits itself into the receptor. And I thought this animation looked a lot like this animation. Some of you might be familiar with it. If you're not, then pay no mind to this whatsoever.
Yes.
Drinking out
Not
of
my chair, not my problem.
exactly. I'm sorry to everyone that doesn't get that. No one in this class has ever once gotten that reference, so I feel very blessed right now. You'd think that I would have taken it out after the 100th student was like, I don't get it. So just like locks, if you want a neurotransmitter to fit into a receptor, it has to be very specific. Its chemical structure has to fit perfectly into this receptor. This is what it actually looks like. We have this molecule of the neurotransmitter that fits into this receptor right here. And this is actually the membrane. It's like the skin of the next neuron. This receptor is like sitting in there. It's embedded in the skin. But this is ugly. So we're going to look at it like that. We're going to pretend that mess of weird corkscrews is not relevant. Now, in terms of drugs, drugs are known as being agonists or antagonists. So an agonist is a drug or a substance that increases the effect of a neurotransmitter. And it can do this in a couple of different ways. It can continue a signal. It can release more of the neurotransmitter, so it does more of its thing, or it can do something called reuptake inhibition, which we'll come back to. And for those of you that are familiar with the full name of SSRIs, which is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that might sound familiar to you. We'll learn how that works. So an agonist increases the effect of neurotransmitter. So if we have a serotonin agonist, it means that that drug is going to increase what serotonin already does in your body. What's an example of a serotonin agonist?
Acid?
Or,
Yes. What was the second thing that someone said? Okay, that's fine. I get it. You know, it happens. Then an antagonist is a substance that decreases the effects of a neurotransmitter. And it can either do that by preventing the actual neurotransmitters from binding, preventing them from doing their thing, kind of sticking itself in the lock and being like, no. Or it can reduce how much of that neurotransmitter is being made, or it can increase reuptake. And again, kind of ignore reuptake for now. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So an antagonist decreases the effects of a neurotransmitter. Now, an example of an antagonist as a drug would be a dissociative, right? A dissociative would decrease the effects of a neurotransmitter that connects your mind and body, which we'll get to in just a second. So that's kind of like an example of how agonists and antagonists come into play. And if you go onto the wiki pages or whatever you're looking at for any drug, you'll see that it's classified as being a neurotransmitter agonist or antagonist. So this gives you an immediate tool to being able to look at a drug on the internet or in literature and be like, oh, okay, so I can automatically get an idea of what this drug does. But first we'll have to go into what the different neurotransmitters do, obviously, in a second. So let's say that we have an antagonist, a drug that blocks a receptor. It does not allow the neurotransmitter to do what it was going to do there. Yeah, I know, I too love Shia LaBeouf. He was great in Holes, you know? So an antagonist prevents a neurotransmitter from doing its thing, in this case at least. There are other ways that an antagonist can exert its power. So again, an agonist causes more of the neurotransmitter's effect to happen. An antagonist causes less of the neurotransmitter's effect to happen. So here's our first neurotransmitter example, is dopamine. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these already, so if this is a review for you, that's great. I promise it will become more complex. If it's not, I'm sorry, I know it's so much. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter, the chemical in your brain that motivates you to receive rewards, and also is involved in motor control and motor function. So you'll see up here that I've classified dopamine as being a big player with stimulants. Can anyone think of, hang on, let me check the chat. Oh my God. Okay, so dopamine is a major player with stimulants, right? Can anyone tell me a way that that might manifest itself and how stimulants make you feel?
Miriam used that word. I would use
I can't really hear you. You're gonna have to get closer to your mic.
Is it like like if you're like I don't know how to answer the question. Like
So think about, for anyone in here, think about any time that you've been on any kind of stimulant, I would say other than caffeine. If anyone in here has been, for instance, on Adderall at some point in the past, think about how you feel. Think about
things that are
sorry.
It makes things that are seemingly uninteresting now rewarding or exciting.
Yes, exactly. And also, interestingly, something like amphetamine has actually been banned in Major League Baseball because it actually does improve your ability to retain muscle tone, interestingly enough, to certain extents, right? But it's called greenies in Major League Baseball because it was a problem that's being used as a performance-enhancing drug because of its influence over motor control, motor function. So dopamine makes you feel rewarded. Now, if we have a dopamine agonist as a drug, such as a stimulant, that means that you would be more rewarded, or you would feel more rewarded for doing things. And next one we're going to look at, again, for all of these, you can see the category that is mainly impacted by this neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. And norepinephrine is it's not pronounced norepinephrine. I thought it was for a long time between the ages of like whatever and whatever. I don't even know, but I'm sure that it's an embarrassingly recent period. But norepinephrine. And this is basically your fight or flight. It's getting you ready for action, more arousal, more alert, right? This is part of the reason that you have an increased heart rate from stimulants, okay? So if something is a norepinephrine agonist, especially if you see on Wikipedia, for instance, if it says high affinity for norepinephrine receptor, it would usually say a specific receptor within norepinephrine because this is the general neurotransmitter, and for these neurotransmitters there can be specific receptors, but we won't get into that. It's very complicated.
Rachel, why would you want to have a fight or flight thing? Most of us are always in adrenaline, too much fight or flight. We're trying to relax. Why would you want to make this more?
It depends on what you're trying to use this drug for, you know? For instance, you have something like Adderall, which it really is just alertness. You know, that's what it is more than anything, is alertness. And technically it is part of your fight or flight system, but your fight or flight system is what keeps you ready and prepared if you're, you know, about to go into a job interview or something like that, right? So it can be very advantageous to have a little bit of norepinephrine in your system to be more aroused, more alert and ready. And I do mean aroused in the literal sense because it also gets you horny in a lot of cases.
Oh, really?
Well, a lot of stimulants do, and then you can't do anything about it. That's like the side effect of stimulants. It increases your libido, but you have issues with executing it in a lot of cases. We'll come back to that when we do the stimulant unit.
And low norepinephrine, to my understanding, can increase the chances of clinical depression too.
That does not surprise me. That's part of why there are antidepressant drugs called SNRIs or SNDRIs, which is serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So, and SNRIs have actually been shown to be quite effective in treating depression as compared to SSRIs. So it's very plausible that norepinephrine has a major role in that.
Quick question. Is it also known as noradrenaline, or is that a different?
And
okay.
We'll come to a page shortly after this where I compare all of the weird, very minor alterations in each of these words that confuse people into fucking oblivion because it's science and everything has 5 words that mean the same thing. So stimulants as an overall category, right, will increase your dopamine and your norepinephrine. They'll increase, or at least they'll increase the actions. They'll increase the impact of dopamine and norepinephrine. So they'll increase your mood and your energy. That's how stimulants exert their effects, is these 2 neurotransmitters. And they'll also increase your CNS, your central nervous system activity. So the activity, basically your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc. And often the speed of your cognitive functioning to a degree. If you overdo it with stimulants, then your cognitive functioning will actually decrease. So some examples of this are Adderall, which is probably the most popularly known or taken. Then others are also Vyvanse and modafinil. Steroids are stimulants. So for instance, inhalers are stimulants, and Ritalin, etc. These are just like the medical versions though. So right on time. So all of these things are actually the same. They look like they're not. Norepinephrine is the same as noradrenaline, is the same as noradrenaline without the E at the end. Then there's epinephrine, which is the same as adrenaline, which is adrenaline without the E at the end. And then there's MDMA, same as Molly, same as ecstasy. And then my favorite, there's neuron, which is also known as a nerve cell, which is also known as a neuron. Because why not? honest to God, scientific community. So just a quick introduction to something, and I want you to pay attention to this person's movement. A lot of documentaries about meth and similar substances are extraordinarily biased. We're only looking at the facts right now. Oh, come on. Always does this. Only looking at the facts right now.
In my kitchen with a machete in one hand and knife in the other.
So watch his movement right now.
A disease of methamphetamine use is addiction. That's the disease. A secondary manifestation of methamphetamine use, people can become Parkinsonian, problems with movement, problems with facial expression, problems with tremor.
The effects of meth change my whole speech and everything. It's gave me like a lisp kind of thing, sort of. It's like it won't come out as clear as it should. But I don't know, it's chemicals or something. It's changed.
Okay, so the chemicals or something did it. Does anyone have a guess what may, okay, question. Are there dopamine agonists that aren't norepinephrine agonists or vice versa? Wondering why all stimulants do both. So this is kind of a generalization for the category. A lot of the times we'll see what's called an atypical stimulant or an atypical psychedelic that don't follow the general pattern. Most stimulants act on both dopamine and norepinephrine. However, there are some stimulants like modafinil, for instance, that has a kind of different effect profile. And there are other stimulants that I can't think of at the top of my head as well that might not impact norepinephrine in the same way. It really is kind of like the stimulant profile is the overall category of a class of drugs that effectively makes you more stimulated, right? And within that, individual drugs might have slightly different profiles. So for instance, modafinil might be slightly different than Adderall in that it impacts neurotransmitters differently. And I will send out an email with a couple of examples of that later. So in terms of this clip that we just saw with this man right here, notice the way, and this is actually something that is seen fairly commonly in heavy chronic stimulant users, and there's a reason for it. Can anyone give me a guess as to why someone might experience tremors and loss of motor control following using stimulants chronically at high doses? Any guesses? It's okay if they're wildly wrong.
Has to do with the dopamine?
Yes.
Well, also your central nervous system. I mean, if you're doing any damage to your central nervous system, your nerves are going to react.
Yeah, and in terms of something like methamphetamine, it's actually one of the few stimulants that is neurotoxic to dopamine neurons. And neurotoxicity means that it has the potential to kill or damage those neurons. So if you are killing or damaging neurons that are responsible for motor control, then you will have Parkinsonian symptoms, because it's thought that Parkinson's disease, which is also classified by tremors, is related to the death or damage to dopamine neurons as well. So we start seeing these effects come into place. But again, we want to avoid stigmatizing drugs like meth and people that use drugs like meth. We're just getting the facts out right now, and we'll come back to it later. Disclaimer about Drugs Lab. This is my favorite YouTube channel because it is oh so much fun to watch. It is a Dutch government-sanctioned drug education YouTube channel that features some hot young people doing all kinds of drugs on camera and showing you like an evaluation basically of how they feel and how their bodies are reacting. So much fun. But you should not take this as gospel. You should not. Drugs Lab has had some problematic incidents where it has conveyed improper, incorrect harm reduction information in the past. The only reason that I think you should watch it is because it gives you an interesting perspective into what people act and look like and feel like when they're on certain drugs that you might not have any exposure to. So keep that in mind, please, if you watch Drugs Lab, because I really do think it's fascinating, but don't listen to all the harm reduction advice that they give you without doing your own research or asking someone first. So let's take a look at Coke.
Ja, maar dat is niet gek. Alles voor de wetenschap. Precies.
Christmas is here again.
Brandt het? Ja, hier heel erg brandt het in mijn neus. En het komt heel langzaam, komt het ook in een
That's called postnasal drip.
Is goed, hè?
Zullen we even wachten? En dan als je het voelt, dan zeg je het dan?
Ja.
Ja?
Ja. Ik merk dat mijn keel en mijn gehemelte zijn verdoofd.
Ja.
Ik vind het niet te pruimen.
Je hartslag die is ook flink omhoog gaan.
Ja.
En je temperatuur ook.
Ik voel me wel drukker, ja. Het is heel gek. Ik kan dus wel opeten heel goed.
Het is een
Door mijn neus
stimulant,
Het is een beetje zo sneeuw in mijn neus. Het voelt ook echt een beetje vol. Ik voel me ook een beetje stout of zo.
En je energielevel, is die hoger dan daarnet?
Nee, niet per se hoger. Ik denk wel wat helderder.
Ja, je zit ook een beetje zo met je mond. Heel scherp. En, ja,
What is it called if her mouth looks tense? Or what might she be doing?
Bruxism.
Bruxism. Nice. Nice.
Ik voel me ook niet heel anders.
Maar wel zelfverzekerd?
Ja.
Ik merk het een beetje.
Ja, wat je normaal kan hebben, zo met monsters in je hoofd. Of van, is het wel goed wat ik doe, moet ik het anders doen? Nu niet zo.
En als er nou iemand naar je toe komt en die gaat ruzie maken. Die zegt van, nou doe eens normaal, trut, ga eens aan de kant. Hoe zou je daarop reageren, hè?
Ja, ik denk toch wel iets agressiever. Ik zou wel lekker ook vinden. Om te vechten.
Ja?
Ja.
Vind ik helemaal niks voor jou.
Nee, is het ook niet. Dat is misschien wel die adrenaline. Daar heb ik inderdaad wel zin in.
Zo. Je raakt je wel goed.
Goeie, hè?
Ja.
All right, we're going to end there for today. Boy, am I behind. Can you imagine me getting through all of these in just like 1 single hour class period? Because that used to happen. I know this was a lot of information. I will be going through and resending out a couple of answers to the questions that were asked and that were brought up. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of DrugsCo, and I will see you on Thursday. And also, please, once again, don't forget that if there's ever been a time in history to legalize and become active, then please use your voice right now. Good time to. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you.
Rachel, are these classes going to be, like, can I go back and watch these classes?
Yes. Are you on the email thread?
Yeah, I'm on the email thread. I just got to it late, and that's why I came late today, so.
I know it's a lot of information. All of the classes have been recorded and posted.
I just have a question. Yes. Do monks mean like just all
whatever? So if you look in the email thread, you should be able to find the Vimeo link. If you can't, let me know and I'll just forward it to you. It has the last 3 lectures posted on it already. The first one was a bit of a hot mess because we had to figure out recording and stuff. But the rest of it.
I was in